On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany lay in ruins, but the hardest challenge was just beginning. Millions of Germans had supported Hitler's regime, from party members to ordinary citizens who had embraced Nazi ideology. The Allied powers faced an almost impossible task. How do you completely transform the mindset of an entire nation? How do you turn dedicated Nazis into democratic citizens? The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union would each develop their own distinct strategies across 4 occupation zones, creating vastly different approaches to the same monumental problem. What happened next was one of history's most ambitious social experiments, and recent 2025 research reveals just how successful it really was. But this massive undertaking didn't begin after Germany's surrender. The blueprint for transformation. Allied planners had been wrestling with this unprecedented challenge since 1943, when the U.S. Pentagon first coined the term denazification to describe their ambitious goal. The formal strategy emerged at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed on the systematic approach needed to transform German society. These weren't military strategists planning battles, but psychologists, political scientists, and administrators trying to solve an unprecedented puzzle. How do you reprogram the minds of millions of people who had genuinely believed in Hitler's vision? The numbers alone were staggering. Over 12 million party members and 45 million affiliated through state organizations had been touched by Nazi ideology. Beyond the formal memberships, millions more had simply absorbed the ideas through 12 years of constant propaganda. The Allied planners weren't just dealing with committed Nazis, they were facing a society where Nazi thinking had become normal. The solution they developed was the 4-zone occupation system, but what most people don't realize is how drastically different each Allied power's approach would become. The Americans wanted aggressive tribunals and mass trials. The British preferred practical administration and gradual reform. The French focused on economic exploitation and quick reconstruction. The Soviets planned complete social revolution combined with political purges. Each zone would essentially become a laboratory for competing theories about human nature and social change. But underneath all these different approaches lurked a fundamental question that nobody could answer with certainty. Can you actually change what people believe through laws and punishment? The planners had studied previous occupations, but nothing came close to what they were attempting. After the Napoleonic Wars, occupying powers had simply restored old monarchies. After World War I, Germany had kept its basic social structure intact. This time, the Allies wanted to reach into German minds and rewire how people thought about authority, race, nationalism, and democracy itself. The 2025 declassified documents reveal just how coordinated this planning really was. Monthly conferences between Allied representatives began in 1943, with detailed discussions about psychological warfare, education reform, and media control. The planners created extensive profiles of German society, mapping out which groups were most susceptible to Nazi ideology and which might be natural allies for democratic reform. They analyzed German psychology, studied the effectiveness of different propaganda techniques, and even conducted experiments on German prisoners of war to test various re-education methods. Yet even as they planned this massive transformation, the Allied powers were already struggling with competing priorities. Justice demanded that Nazi war criminals be punished severely and that ordinary Germans face consequences for their support of the regime. But stability required getting German society functioning again as quickly as possible. Punishment meant removing experienced administrators, teachers, and technical specialists from their jobs. Reconstruction meant putting some of these same people back to work. The planners knew they couldn't have both perfect justice and rapid recovery. Then the Cold War began emerging even before Germany surrendered, and everything changed. Stalin's increasingly aggressive behavior made Western leaders realize they needed a strong, stable Germany as a buffer against Soviet expansion. Suddenly, the goal shifted from transforming German society to simply ensuring German loyalty to the West. The elaborate plans for long-term ideological change started giving way to more immediate political calculations about preventing communist influence. The centerpiece of the entire denazification effort became the Fragebogen, a 131-question survey that would determine the fate of millions of Germans. This wasn't just a simple questionnaire, it was a comprehensive investigation into every aspect of a person's life during the Nazi period. The form asked about party memberships, military service, financial donations to Nazi causes, participation in rallies, reading habits, and even personal relationships with Nazi officials. Allied planners designed it to cross-reference answers against captured Nazi party archives, police records, and witness testimonies. The Fragebogen system created 5 categories that would define post-war German society: major offenders who faced prison or death, offenders who lost their jobs and property, lesser offenders who paid fines, followers who faced minor restrictions, and those who were completely exonerated. Every adult German would be processed through the system, creating what amounted to a massive social sorting operation. The planners believed this bureaucratic approach would be more fair and systematic than the arbitrary justice that had followed previous wars. Recent research shows just how revolutionary this systematic approach really was. Throughout history, victorious armies had typically focused on punishing leaders and seizing wealth, but they had never attempted to categorize and process entire populations based on their political beliefs. The Allied planners were essentially inventing a new form of social control, one that tried to measure degrees of guilt and assign appropriate consequences. They were creating a bureaucracy of moral judgment on a scale never before attempted. The logistics were mind-boggling. Processing 13 million questionnaires required thousands of investigators, translators, and clerks. The Allies had to create entirely new administrative systems, train personnel in complex legal procedures, and coordinate between different occupation zones with different languages and legal traditions. They built special camps to hold suspected war criminals, established tribunals to hear appeals, and created monitoring systems to track the progress of denazification across all of Germany. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the whole operation was revealed in recently declassified documents. The Allies had compiled arrest lists of nearly 250,000 specific individuals before Germany even surrendered. Using intelligence gathered during the war, they had identified not just obvious targets like SS officers and party leaders, but also local administrators, teachers, journalists, and business leaders who had supported the Nazi regime. The moment German forces laid down their weapons, Allied teams were ready to begin mass arrests based on these pre-prepared lists. However, before this massive bureaucratic machinery could begin processing millions of ordinary Germans, the Allies needed to establish the legal framework that would define what constituted a crime worth prosecuting. The answer would come from an unprecedented experiment in international justice: the Nuremberg Precedent. On November 20, 1945, just 6 months after Germany's surrender, something unprecedented in human history began in a damaged courthouse in Nuremberg. For the first time ever, the leaders of a defeated nation would face trial not in a military tribunal or domestic court, but in an international criminal court where 4 victorious powers would jointly prosecute crimes that had never before been legally defined. The defendants sat in 2 rows, 21 men who had once commanded millions and shaped the fate of Europe, now facing charges for waging aggressive war, committing war crimes, and perpetrating crimes against humanity. The legal framework itself was revolutionary. International law had traditionally focused on relations between states, not on holding individuals accountable for state-sponsored atrocities. The Allied powers had to invent entirely new legal concepts to prosecute systematic genocide, mass deportations, and the deliberate targeting of civilian populations. They created the legal precedent that following orders was not a valid defense for committing atrocities, and that heads of state could be held personally responsible for their government's actions. These principles would later become the foundation for international criminal law, influencing everything from the Yugoslav tribunals to the International Criminal Court. The scope of the Nuremberg proceedings extended far beyond the famous main trial. Between 1945 and 1949, American military tribunals alone conducted 12 additional trials involving 185 defendants, while British and French courts handled dozens more cases. In total, 199 defendants faced prosecution across all Nuremberg proceedings, ranging from high-ranking officials like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess to concentration camp doctors, judges, and industrial leaders who had used slave labor. Each trial required prosecutors to prove not just that atrocities had occurred, but that individual defendants had personally participated in or ordered specific criminal acts. The challenge of prosecuting these crimes was complicated by the fact that the entire German legal system had been compromised. German courts had legitimized persecution of Jews, authorized forced sterilizations, and approved the murder of disabled individuals. German lawyers had drafted laws that stripped citizenship from minorities, and German judges had sentenced thousands to death for minor infractions. The Allied prosecutors couldn't simply rely on German legal precedents because those precedents had been corrupted by Nazi ideology. They had to construct entirely new legal arguments about what constituted criminal behavior by government officials. The 2025 research based on recently declassified documents reveals the extraordinary level of cooperation between Allied powers during the trials. Despite growing tensions that would soon lead to the Cold War, American, British, French, and Soviet legal teams worked together to share evidence, coordinate prosecution strategies, and establish consistent legal standards. Soviet prosecutors provided crucial testimony about atrocities on the Eastern Front, while American investigators contributed detailed financial records showing how German businesses had profited from forced labor. British intelligence services supplied intercepts of German communications that proved high-level coordination of war crimes. The trials served a dual purpose that went beyond simple legal justice. Allied planners designed the proceedings to educate both the German public and the international community about the full extent of Nazi crimes. They required German newspapers to publish daily trial reports, and they distributed translated transcripts throughout the occupation zones. The goal was to confront Germans with undeniable evidence of what had been done in their name, making it impossible for them to claim ignorance about the Holocaust or other atrocities. The use of film evidence at Nuremberg was particularly innovative and devastating. Allied prosecutors used captured Nazi films and American liberation footage, creating a unique precedent in international law. The Nazis had been obsessive record keepers, documenting their activities with bureaucratic precision. SS photographers had filmed executions, concentration camp operations, and medical experiments. Wehrmacht units had taken photographs of massacres on the Eastern Front. The prosecution used this evidence to let the Nazis convict themselves with their own documentation. When films of concentration camp liberation were shown in the courtroom, several defendants removed their headphones to avoid hearing the audio, while others visibly broke down under the weight of the evidence. Behind the scenes, intense negotiations determined which defendants would face trial and which would be used as witnesses. The Allies had captured hundreds of potential defendants, but they could only prosecute a manageable number in high-profile trials. They chose defendants who represented different aspects of the Nazi regime: political leaders, military commanders, bureaucrats, and industrialists. Some captured officials were offered immunity in exchange for testimony against higher-ranking defendants. These negotiations revealed the practical compromises necessary to make the trials manageable while still achieving their educational and legal goals. The trials also established important precedents for handling evidence in international prosecutions. Prosecutors had to deal with massive amounts of documentation in multiple languages, witness testimony from traumatized survivors, and the challenge of proving systematic patterns of criminal behavior across multiple countries and time periods. They developed new techniques for organizing evidence, authenticating documents, and presenting complex historical narratives in a courtroom setting. These methods became standard practice for later international criminal tribunals. The impact on German public opinion was more complex than the Allied planners had anticipated. Contemporary polls showed that only 6% of Germans saw the trials as unfair, yet many others dismissed them as victor's justice imposed by the winning side. Some Germans argued that Allied bombing of German cities and Soviet treatment of German prisoners also constituted war crimes, making the trials seem one-sided. The trials succeeded in documenting Nazi crimes for history, but they were less successful at immediately changing German attitudes about responsibility for the war. However, the very success of the Nuremberg trials created unrealistic expectations for the broader denazification process. The trials had shown that it was possible to hold Nazi leaders accountable through legal proceedings, but they had dealt with only a few hundred defendants out of millions of Germans who had supported the regime. The dramatic success of prosecuting major war criminals made it seem like the entire denazification process should be equally thorough and decisive, setting a standard that would prove impossible to maintain. The Allies now needed a systematic way to process millions of ordinary Germans, and they would find their answer in a deceptively simple bureaucratic tool: the questionnaire revolution. The Fragebogen looked like an ordinary government form, but this 131-question document drafted by the American military government would determine whether millions of Germans could work, vote, or even remain in their homes. Starting in 1946, every adult German over 18 had to complete this comprehensive questionnaire, creating what became history's largest background investigation. The form asked everything from basic biographical information to detailed questions about Nazi party membership, financial contributions to Nazi causes, participation in rallies, and personal relationships with SS officers. Question 27 demanded a complete list of all organizations joined since 1933. Question 45 required explanations for any promotions received during the war. Question 78 asked about attitudes toward Jewish persecution. The questionnaire wasn't just collecting information. It was forcing Germans to confront their own complicity in the Nazi system. This bureaucratic tool became the backbone of denazification across all 4 occupation zones. Allied administrators had designed the Fragebogen to work like a massive sorting machine, categorizing every German adult into 5 distinct groups based on their level of Nazi involvement. Major offenders faced imprisonment or death, while offenders lost their jobs and property. Lesser offenders paid fines and faced employment restrictions. Followers received warnings and temporary limitations, and the exonerated faced no penalties whatsoever. By 1948, over 90% of processed Germans were classified as mere followers or completely exonerated. The scale of this operation was staggering. Between 1946 and 1949, Allied authorities processed 13 million questionnaires across all occupation zones. In the American zone alone, tribunals handled 3.4 million cases. The British processed 2.5 million forms, while the French and Soviet zones each dealt with millions more. This wasn't just paperwork. Each questionnaire required extensive investigation. Allied teams had to cross-reference answers against captured Nazi party membership rolls, SS personnel files, Gestapo records, and witness testimonies. They examined bank records to verify claims about financial contributions, checked employment histories against company records, and interviewed neighbors about applicants' wartime behavior. The logistical challenges were immense. The Americans established 545 denazification tribunals staffed by German appointees under Allied supervision. Each tribunal needed investigators, translators, clerks, and appeals processors. The British created regional screening boards that met daily to review cases. The French established local committees that combined French officials with German advisors. The Soviets used Communist Party cells to investigate and make recommendations. All 4 zones had to coordinate their efforts to prevent convicted Nazis from simply moving to areas with more lenient policies. But the questionnaire system quickly revealed an unexpected problem that would undermine the entire denazification effort. Many of the most committed Nazis were also the most competent administrators, teachers, engineers, and technical specialists that Germany desperately needed for reconstruction. Local German officials found themselves in impossible situations. They could either follow denazification rules and remove experienced personnel, or they could ignore the rules and keep society functioning. A typical example was the Bavarian education system, where 80% of teachers had been Nazi party members. Removing all of them would have closed most schools, but keeping them meant putting former Nazis in charge of educating German children about democracy. This dilemma created a massive cottage industry of false testimonials and document forgery. Germans began calling these fake character references Persilschein, after the popular laundry detergent, because they supposedly washed away Nazi stains. Friends, neighbors, and former colleagues would write testimonials claiming that someone had secretly opposed the Nazi regime, had joined the party only under duress, or had protected Jewish acquaintances. Underground networks emerged to coach people on how to answer questionnaire questions, what documentation to present, and which tribunals were most lenient. Some estimates suggest that up to 40% of testimonials submitted to denazification tribunals contained false or misleading information. The psychological impact of the mass questionnaire process on German society was profound according to 2025 research. Millions of Germans were forced to examine their own actions during the Nazi period in minute detail, creating what psychologists now recognize as a form of collective self-examination. The process made private behavior public, as neighbors testified about each other's wartime activities. Many Germans experienced what researchers describe as moral whiplash, being told that beliefs and actions they had considered patriotic and normal were now criminal and shameful. The questionnaire system created a new form of social hierarchy based on degrees of Nazi involvement, with the exonerated gaining social prestige while followers faced ongoing stigma. The different occupation zones applied vastly different standards to identical questionnaire responses, creating massive inequalities in how Germans were treated. American tribunals initially took a harsh approach, classifying party members as offenders even if they had played minor roles. British authorities were more pragmatic, focusing on whether someone could contribute to Reconstruction rather than their past political activities. French zones were remarkably lenient, often classifying even SS officers as mere followers if they possessed needed skills. Soviet zones combined denazification with broader social transformation, using the questionnaire process to eliminate entire social classes rather than just Nazi supporters. The questionnaire system also revealed the limitations of bureaucratic approaches to moral and political transformation. The forms could document what people had done, but they couldn't measure what people actually believed or predict how they would behave in a democratic society. Someone who had enthusiastically supported Nazi ideology might technically qualify as exonerated if they had avoided formal party membership, while someone who had joined the party reluctantly for career advancement might be classified as an offender. The system measured Nazi involvement more accurately than Nazi commitment. The bureaucratic revolution had sorted millions of Germans into neat categories, but it had failed to fundamentally transform German society or eliminate Nazi influence from positions of authority. However, the questionnaire system was just one part of a much larger Allied strategy, and each occupation power had developed its own distinct approach to implementing denazification.